On a sweltering July night in 1967, inside a cramped rehearsal room off Sunset Boulevard, Sky Saxon stood beneath a single buzzing light, his shadow trembling against the peeling walls. His voice glowed with the raw electricity that would soon define a generation, yet something darker whispered behind his eyes, a quiet fracture the world never saw. Fame was rising fast, swirling around him like psychedelic smoke. But so were the secrets, the cult that awaited him, the addictions that burned at the edges of his mind, the betrayal that would follow him for decades. Even in that moment of promise, a strange heaviness lingered in the air, as if fate had already made its choice. Before the world crowned him a legend of garage rock, destiny had already carved a far more tragic script into his life, one he could never escape. This is the untold truth of Sky Saxon. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Sky Saxon's childhood wounds, hidden fractures, and the emotional machinery that shaped his future collapse. Long before the neon chaos of Sunset Strip wrapped itself around his name, Sky Saxon was simply Richard Elvern Marsh, a quiet boy moving like a ghost through a strict, religious household that never truly saw him. His childhood didn't explode with dramatic violence. Instead, it eroded him slowly, the way water hollows stone. Every rule in that house felt carved in granite, every mistake magnified, every dream treated as a threat to order. And young Richard learned early that silence was safer than honesty. Family members later described the Marsh household with polite phrases like disciplined or traditional, but beneath those words was an emotional climate colder than the Oregon winters they lived through. Affection was rationed, praise nearly extinct, and creativity, especially the wild, restless kind bubbling inside him, was viewed almost as sin. When he hummed melodies or tapped rhythms on tabletops, the adults didn't hear potential, they heard disobedience. Music didn't belong in that house unless it was hymns, and Richard's mind was already drifting far from anything sacred. He was often labeled too sensitive, a phrase repeated so casually that it eventually became a diagnosis, a warning, a quiet condemnation. Sensitivity, in that family, meant weakness. Imagination meant defiance, and yearning for more, for color, for noise, for attention meant ingratitude. Those labels stuck to him the way dust clings to old vinyl sleeves, shaping the man he would become long before he picked up a microphone. There was one moment, recounted by a distant relative, that crystallized everything. Richard had shared a small notebook filled with childish lyrics, metaphors, and strange cosmic images he couldn't explain. Instead of encouragement, he was met with a flat, dismissive line: "You need to stop dreaming and start behaving." And as is so was Adidvitas. It was simple, almost gentle, but devastating, the kind of sentence that sinks deeper with time. That sentence stayed with him for life. Eventually, the emotional distance inside the house turned into existential loneliness. Richard realized he had no place to express his interior world. No one asked what he felt. No one asked what he feared. And certainly no one wanted to know what he imagined. He began to develop a quiet hunger, not for fame, not yet, but for someone to understand him without trying to fix him. This hunger later made him magnetic to strangers and dangerously vulnerable to manipulators. As he moved through adolescence, he developed a habit of drifting jobs, towns, and friendships, never staying long enough to form roots. The world outside suddenly felt bigger, stranger, and more inviting than the narrow rooms of his childhood. Rock and roll was erupting, psychedelic culture was stirring beneath the surface, and Richard wanted to feel part of something that didn't judge him for being different. His trauma didn't scream for attention, It whispered for belonging. But wounds like his rarely remain dormant. Because he'd grown up in a home where emotions were treated like trespassers, he entered adulthood without the tools to defend himself from emotional predators. He could sing with conviction, command a stage, and hypnotize an audience. Yet privately, he was pliable, impressionable, and unable to parse genuine affection from manipulation. Anyone who offered him attention, spiritual meaning, or the illusion of unconditional acceptance had immediate access to him. This pattern would define his romantic life, his artistic collaborations, and eventually the catastrophic decisions that entangled him with cult leaders and drug-fueled spiritual communities. And as so was Adidvidus. But it all began with the original fracture, a childhood where he was present but unseen, obedient but unfulfilled, loved in theory but rarely in practice. Even in later interviews, long after he'd reinvented himself as Sky Saxon, he hinted at these early wounds. He spoke of searching for truth, of finding a family that understood vibration, of being reborn through sound. Fans interpreted these statements as psychedelic poetry, but underneath was something much older, a boy still trying to fill the empty spaces left behind by the family who taught him to fear his own inner world. Sky's rise, his addictions, his spiritual obsessions, none of these were accidents. They were the echoes of a childhood built on silence, suppression, and the slow erosion of self. Before the world crowned him a psychedelic pioneer, he had already learned the cost of being different. And that cost followed him through every stage of his life. Sky Saxon's climb into psychedelic fame, the seductive illusion of control, and the sacrifices he never admitted. Success didn't arrive for Richard Marsh in a clean, triumphant arc. It came in jolts, strange, electric moments where the world suddenly pulled him forward, only to let him fall back again. But each time, he rose a little higher, a little closer to becoming the man the world would later call Sky Saxon. His transformation began with small clubs, the kind where cigarette smoke curled like ghosts and amplifiers hummed louder than the audiences. He was hungry then, not for money, not even for fame, but for the feeling of finally being heard. The first time he stepped in front of a microphone, something inside him aligned. The quiet, overlooked child from a rigid home suddenly had a voice big enough to fill a room. The contrast was intoxicating. By the early 1960 seconds, he'd already tried on several musical identities, drifting between doo-wop and experimental rock. He wasn't a chameleon by strategy. He was a man searching for a sound that matched the turbulence inside him. That search eventually led him to gather a group of musicians who felt equally restless. They would become the Seeds, the band that would catapult him into the mythology of American garage rock. The sound they created wasn't polished or market-driven. It was raw, pulsating, almost feral, a reflection of Sky's inner world more than anything else. When they played Pushin' Too Hard, Sky wasn't just singing, he was confessing. Every line carried the residue of his childhood frustrations, his lifelong resistance to control, and his desperate urge for freedom. And the world felt it. Pushin' Too Hard didn't just chart, it ignited. Suddenly, Sky's voice, once dismissed as the rambling of a dreamer, became the anthem of a generation pushing against authority. Teenagers screamed the lyrics as if he had spoken the sentence they'd been waiting to hear. Producers who once ignored him now called daily. And clubs that previously offered him nothing but free beer now begged for the Seeds to headline. Success changed the rooms around him. They got bigger, brighter, louder. The air buzzed differently, charged with expectation. But something else changed too. Sky began to sense the price. Fame created shadows where none existed before. Everywhere he went, people projected their fantasies onto him, the psychedelic prophet, the counterculture saint, the unpredictable genius. But no one asked who he really was. Sky didn't correct them. In fact, he embraced the personas. Reinventing himself was easier than being himself. As the Seeds reached national attention, performing on television and touring relentlessly, Sky found himself living in a paradox, adored by crowds yet unable to maintain genuine intimacy with anyone around him. Stardom amplified the wounds he'd spent years trying to hide. He became more theatrical, more spiritual, more unpredictable traits the media labeled as eccentricity, but which were, in truth, symptoms of emotional exhaustion. There was a cost for every cheer, every spotlight, every hit record. And Sky paid it quietly. The touring lifestyle, sleepless nights, chaotic schedules, constant pressure pushed Sky to chase energy wherever he could find it. At first, it was simply adrenaline, the natural high of performing. But soon, he drifted into the blooming psychedelic culture bubbling beneath Los Angeles. LSD, which many saw as a tool for enlightenment, became something else entirely for Sky, an escape hatch, a shortcut to the cosmic truth he believed he'd been denied in childhood. Friends later described seeing him take tabs with a kind of ritualistic focus, as if each drop on his tongue brought him closer to the acceptance he'd never received at home. He claimed it helped him clear the static, leveling the noise inside his mind. But those closest to him saw the consequences: unpredictable mood swings, paranoid episodes, bursts of energy followed by profound isolation. And still, he pushed forward. When the Seeds recorded a web of sound, Sky poured himself into the sessions with an intensity that frightened his bandmates. He demanded dozens of takes, then sometimes discarded them all because the vibration didn't feel right. He'd rewrite lyrics on scraps of napkins, pacing the room, whispering melodies to himself as if receiving them from some invisible realm. It was genius, yes, but it was also a man fraying at the edges. The Seeds, for all their chemistry, struggled under the weight of Sky's growing obsessions. He wanted to evolve faster than the band could follow. He wanted bigger themes, stranger sounds, deeper meanings. And as the music industry shifted, moving toward polished psychedelic pop, Sky resisted, refusing to compromise his artistic identity. This refusal was admirable, but it also cost the Seeds their momentum. Record labels grew impatient. Audiences moved on. The band, once poised for lasting fame, slowly drifted into cult status instead. Sky didn't mourn the decline the way others might. To him, the collapse of mainstream success was simply another sign he needed to seek something beyond the material world. He believed the Seeds had been a vessel, a temporary bridge to something more cosmic. While his bandmates tried to salvage what remained of their careers, Sky began exploring new spiritual communities, convinced he was destined for a different kind of greatness. This belief, part conviction, part delusion, led him toward the most consequential pivot of his life, his immersion into the Source family, a cult that promised enlightenment but delivered dependency. It was a shift that confused fans and alienated collaborators. But to Sky, it made perfect sense. Fame had left him hollow. Music had taken everything, but returned only fleeting moments of clarity. The world he'd built through talent and sheer will no longer felt like enough. He wanted transformation. He wanted belonging. He wanted absolution. And he was willing to abandon the success he'd fought so hard to build to find those things. In the end, The very gifts that had lifted him, his sensitivity, his imagination, his hunger for meaning, became the forces that pulled him into a world where sacrifice was disguised as salvation. His rise was never simply about fame. It was about the lengths a wounded man would go to fill the emptiness that applause could never touch. Sky Saxon wasn't destroyed by the spotlight. He was destroyed by the shadows it revealed. Sky Saxon's descent into spiritual manipulation, toxic devotion, and the betrayal that rewired his fate. Love was always the soft bruise beneath Sky Saxon's ribs, the wound he kept pressing even when it hurt. Fame made him desirable, but it never made him secure. He walked through relationships the way someone walks through smoke, reaching, touching, hoping, never quite grasping the shape of what he wanted. And because he didn't know how to protect himself, he gravitated toward the very people who knew how to bend him. By the time Sky encountered the Source family, his romantic life had already become a revolving mirror. Each partner reflected what he most feared: abandonment, manipulation, dependency. Some girlfriends loved the idea of him more than the man himself. Others pushed him aside the moment they saw the damage fame had done. And a few recognized just how fragile he was under the psychedelic bravado and used that fragility to secure their own influence. But none of them shaped him as deeply as what happened after he stepped into the orbit of Father Yod, the charismatic and controversial leader of the Source family. Sky didn't join the group for love, at least not at first. He joined it for meaning. Yet once inside, love became the currency, measured, controlled, rationed, and Sky submitted to it the way a drowning man submits to the weight of the water around him. Inside the commune, affection wasn't romantic, it was political. Who you loved determined your rank. Who loved you back determined your access. And Sky, newly renamed Sunlight Aquarian, was both adored and exploited. To some, he was a spiritual recruit with musical gifts. To others, he was a symbolic trophy, proof that the Source family could seduce talent as easily as it seduced seekers. He also became entangled in romantic bonds that were anything but free. Women in the community were encouraged to share energy, a euphemism for emotional and physical intimacy directed by Father Yod's hierarchy. Sky was often paired with women who looked at him not as a partner, but as a project. They saw him as a star dimmed by the material world, someone they believed they could purify. In truth, what they purified was his autonomy. One former member recalled that Sky took love like a command, adjusting himself to whatever desire or doctrine was projected onto him. That was the tragedy of it. He loved quickly, surrendered too easily, and accepted dominance disguised as devotion. He had spent his entire life yearning to be chosen. Inside the cult, being chosen was the most dangerous thing that could happen to him. And then came the defining betrayal. One that twisted the emotional knife deeper than any breakup or artistic disappointment ever could. Father Yod, known for his commanding presence and spiritual absolutism, frequently reminded members that individuality was an illusion. Everything, love, body, identity belonged to the family. And Sky, eager to belong, embraced the doctrine. But somewhere along the way, the line between faith and possession blurred. Sky confided in a close companion that he felt assigned rather than loved, redirected rather than respected. He knew the difference, even if he pretended not to. And when he finally found someone inside the commune whom he genuinely connected with, a woman who saw him not as Sunlight Aquarian, but as Sky Father Yod, intervened. The relationship was abruptly severed. The woman was reassigned. Sky was told the connection was too earthly, too emotional, too ego-driven. and quote, in other words, too real. The man who had sung about freedom suddenly found himself denied the one thing he had chased his entire life, a love that felt honest. According to several who witnessed the fallout, Sky didn't argue. He simply collapsed inward, folding his heartbreak into the mystical language of the group. He told himself it was for spiritual growth. He told himself he didn't deserve to question the hierarchy. He told himself that surrender was enlightenment. But privately, the betrayal shattered him. Friends outside the cult noticed the change immediately. The Sky they remembered, erratic but brilliant, unpredictable yet fiercely independent, disappeared behind a layer of cosmic jargon and forced serenity. He spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb some invisible balance. He deferred to others in ways that felt unnatural. His music shifted from rebellion to submission. This emotional disintegration deepened when he became romantically involved with someone who understood exactly how to manipulate his vulnerabilities. She wasn't cruel in the conventional sense. She was strategic. She knew that Sky's deepest fear was being unloved, and that his greatest weakness was wanting to be understood. She alternated warmth with distance, adoration with correction, devotion with cold spiritual superiority. The push and pull kept him anchored to her, desperate to regain the closeness she withheld. Someone who was close to them described it this way: she didn't break him suddenly. She broke him slowly, beautifully, in a way that looked like guidance. It was the perfect description of emotional control. The climax of Sky's romantic downfall wasn't a fight or a dramatic departure. It was a moment of quiet realization, one that arrived too late. During a late-night conversation, after a string of conflicts, she allegedly told him, "People love your music, Sky. But no one will ever love you unless you become what we need." The sentence struck him like a prophecy, and in a tragic way, he believed it. From that moment, he became more compliant, more malleable, more spiritually obedient. He let others dictate his relationships, his movements, his identity. He had climbed out of one controlling home only to walk willingly into another, a hierarchy wrapped in incense and cosmic language instead of religious sternness. Love, the thing he chased his entire life, became the knife that cut the deepest. Sky's tragedy was never that he loved too foolishly. His tragedy was that he loved too completely. And the people who held his heart understood exactly how to use that devotion to shape his descent. Sky Saxon's final descent, the medical collapse no one saw coming, and the legacy carved from a lifetime of spiritual hunger. The years that followed Sky Saxon's immersion into the Source family unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. There was no single explosion, no unmistakable downfall. Instead, his life deteriorated the way a structure decays when the foundation has rotted quietly, invisibly, from the inside out. After the commune disbanded and Father Yo died in a bizarre hang-gliding accident, Sky drifted again, older now, and carrying the weight of experiences too heavy for anyone who'd lived them. The band that had once defined him. The Seeds attempted sporadic reunions, but they were never the same. Time had sanded down the edges of their rage, and fame had become a fading echo rather than a compass. Sky's voice still carried its strange electricity, but the spirit behind it had dimmed. He was present, but only partly. Those close to him described a man caught between dimensions, half in the material world, half drifting through a personal cosmos shaped by decades of spiritual doctrine, psychedelic exploration, and emotional erosion. He spoke of vibrations, energies, past lives, cosmic messages. And though some listeners found this mystical, others sensed it as a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of the fractures he never healed. But the greatest danger was not metaphysical. It was physical. Sky had lived most of his life as if his body were an inconvenience, a vessel that could be neglected in service of higher meaning. He rarely spoke about medical issues, believing instead in spiritual purification and natural healing. It was a philosophy nurtured by the Source family and later reinforced by various fringe wellness communities he encountered. He trusted herbs, fruit fasts, raw diets, improvised detox rituals. What he did not trust were doctors. This was the beginning of the slow and tragic deterioration that would eventually take his life. In the late 2000s, friends noticed troubling changes. His weight fluctuated dramatically. His energy wavered between manic bursts and profound fatigue. He developed chronic pain issues that he attributed to energetic imbalance, not physical illness. He dismissed medical checkups. He insisted he could heal through intention. Is a say, W.A. And then came the infection. No one knew exactly when it began, only that it progressed quietly, a bacterial assault that infiltrated his organs. Sky believed it was a temporary issue, something he could manage through his usual spiritual remedies. He treated it with homemade tonics, meditation, herbs, and long periods of fasting. He refused medication. He refused hospitalization. He refused anything that contradicted the spiritual identity he'd built for decades. But infections do not negotiate. They do not respect faith, devotion, purity, or transcendence. They spread. By the time Sky allowed himself to be taken to the hospital in Austin, Texas, the damage was catastrophic. The infection had reached his kidneys. His immune system was overwhelmed. Doctors described the case as severely advanced, the kind that requires immediate and aggressive intervention. For Sky, intervention came too late. The man who had spent his life searching for cosmic truth now found himself lying in a sterile hospital room, surrounded not by followers or fellow seekers, but by machines tracking the slow collapse of his body. Fans would later romanticize these final days, imagining him fading into some psychedelic afterlife. But the medical truth was far more brutal. His organs were failing. His body was shutting down. He was dying from complications totally preventable with timely care. On the 25th of June, 2009, the same day the world lost Michael Jackson, Sky Saxon departed quietly, overshadowed by the most publicized celebrity death of the decade. His passing barely touched the headlines. Some newspapers printed short obituaries. A few lifelong fans mourned. But in the vast machinery of Hollywood and rock history, Sky slipped away almost unnoticed. It was, in a dark way, fitting. He had always lived in the in-between, revered by cult followers, overlooked by mainstream history, influential to musicians who didn't even know his name. His death mirrored his life, impactful, but not loudly acknowledged. Yet the truth of his downfall wasn't the infection itself. The truth was the pattern behind it. Sky's entire life had been shaped by systems that discouraged vulnerability. A childhood where emotions were sinful. A music industry where weakness was exploited. A cult where individuality was erased. Communities that romanticized suffering as enlightenment. Relationships where devotion was traded for control. A belief system where medical care was mistrusted, delayed, avoided. The infection was simply the final manifestation of a lifelong refusal or inability to protect himself. His death raised an uncomfortable conversation about the counterculture generation. The musicians, artists, seekers, and dreamers who traded conventional stability for spiritual liberation, only to be abandoned by the very ideologies they embraced. Sky became a symbol of that contradiction. The man who sang about breaking free ultimately became trapped by the philosophies meant to liberate him. Yet his legacy is far from tragic. For every musician who ever echoed the raw, hypnotic pulse of garage rock, for every fan who found rebellion in his trembling vocals, for every outsider who felt understood by his strange, cosmic poetry, Sky Saxon remains a foundational voice, someone who carried the spirit of counterculture not as a trend, but as a life calling. His influence stretches through generations: punk bands who studied his minimalism, psychedelic revivalists who borrowed his mysticism, indie artists who discovered him through obscure vinyl reissues. Sky never became a household name, but he became something rarer, a musician whose impact moves invisibly, like current beneath an ocean. Quiet, but unstoppable. And there is an irony in that. The man who spent a lifetime feeling unseen ultimately shaped a cultural movement that never forgot him. His voice remains preserved on grainy recordings, his presence immortalized in the underground archives of American rock history. His flaws, his contradictions, his wounds, all of them became part of the mythology. Sky Saxon's downfall was the result of choices shaped by trauma, devotion, and longing. But his legacy is the result of something stronger, a relentless refusal to silence himself. In the end, the truth of Sky's life is not found in the hospital room where he died, nor in the cult where he was spiritually dismantled, nor even in the band that carried him to fame. It is found in the echo he left behind, the echo of a man who tried, again and again, to turn pain into sound, silence into rebellion, and vulnerability into art. And that echo has never stopped vibrating.